In this video, I'm going to go over every single card that I could possibly want to play in Modern Merfolk in 2020. Hey Fish Fam, this is Nikachu, Merfolk Master. And the advantage of playing Merfolk in Modern is that it is so adaptable. Pending what metagame you play, you could reach for any different particular card from the Merfolk Toolbox. If your opponents are running a lot of red or green creatures, you can play Tidebinder Mage. If your opponents are running a lot of graveyard strategies, you can reach between Relic of Progenitus, Grafdigger's Cage. There are many options. If you need more lords, you go heavier on Merfolk Mistbinder, on Marrow Regery. If you need more interaction against the creatures, you can reach for Dismember. The Merfolk Toolbox is exactly the advantage that gives Merfolk the ability to win in today's modern metagame. And today I'm going to go over every single card that you could possibly want to consider playing in the Merfolk deck in 2020. We're going to start off with the creatures. And the creatures really are the soul of a Merfolk deck because they are our win condition. Merfolk has a bit of a soft win condition. Our win condition is playing creatures, hoping they don't get countered, hope they don't get killed, hope they don't get blocked when we attack. Then we deal damage to our opponent, and then we rinse and repeat this process until our opponent goes from 20 to 0 life. So let us start off with Benthic Biomancer. Now Benthic Biomancer isn't exactly the best Merfolk out there. However, it is still probably the best one drop that we have for mono blue for the Merfolk shell. It's just a 1/1 for 1 blue, so there will be games where you start off with Benthic Biomancer and combine it with a Lord on turn 2, a Lord on turn 3, a Lord on turn 4. That will equal 20 damage. But so we have potential turn 4 kills, but the real ability on this thing is the adapt. For a blue and a generic, you can loot away a card from your hand while also making Benthic Biomancer bigger, getting rid of dead draws, dead extra lands. That's what we have Benthic Biomancer for. Now, I would say we also have Curse Catcher, definitely on the weaker side of Merfolk spells in our deck. Curse Catcher has gotten a lot worse over the last few years because the main cards that you want to counter are things like Planeswalkers, creatures, but Curse Catcher only counters things like instants and sorceries, and the taxing isn't even that large. Only 1 mana. A lot of decks can pay for this easily, as the mana cost of cards the average mana cost keeps going down. But there have been some builds with Curse Catcher recently preying on things like burn, so I don't want to completely count it out. I still have Curse Catcher in my toolbox. But then we have Mistcaller, an excellent card to include if you're trying to beat up graveyard strategies. You sacrifice Mistcaller, and until end of turn, if a non-token creature would enter the battlefield and it wasn't cast, you exile it instead. Excellent card to reach for against Dredge. Excellent card to reach for against Devoted Devastation. Against Collected Company. They try to Collected Company, you sacrifice Mistcaller, and any creatures that enter the battlefield are just going to get exiled. This is a card that you could see in your main deck in a very graveyard-heavy metagame, or you can keep it in the sideboard. We also have Phantasmal Image, pretty weak card in a metagame of Walking Ballista and Lava Dart, because it's not a really big cost to just target the Phantasmal Image and blow it away, but has really good synergy with Master of Waves, doubling the amount of elemental tokens that you have on the battlefield. Not to mention, Phantasmal Image can be good at copying your creature lands like Mutavault, and just randomly being an extra lord could be something that you could be in for. Silvergill Adapt, of course, this is one of the core cards of Merfolk. You pay 2 mana for a 2/1 creature, enters the battlefield, draws a card. Not much else to say about that. Silvergill Adapt has been relatively core to the deck for a very, very long time, only being replaced sometimes. I've done it before when the metagame is so aggressive that a clock going down on the beatdown strategy is more important than drawing cards. Coral Helm Commander is good if you are trying to limit the converted mana cost of your deck while still having a lord on the battlefield. I have found that Coral Helm Commander is very nice to have when you're up against Plague Engineers, because you can just bump Coral Helm Commander up to a 2, get it up to level 2, and now it's a 3/3 flyer, and even if it's been shrunk down by Plague Engineer a little bit, still flying in for good amounts of damage, breaking those board stalls while being a lord by itself once you get it up to level 4. Harbinger the Tides is going to be where you want to be if you really need tempo, but works particularly best if the creatures that you are bouncing comes at a big cost. For example, if the creature costs 3, 4, or 5 mana, bouncing those cards are useful. So bouncing Thought-Knot Seer, bouncing Reality Smasher, that is a tempo swing. Bouncing 1 mana creatures is not a big tempo swing unless it comes with card advantage. So against Infect, if you can bounce the creature at end of turn, stopping them for a turn, that could be worth it. Also, if you can bounce it in response to a pump spell, that also could be worth it. Harbinger the Tides, overall has to be in that sort of meta game where you're going to have those 2-for-1 potentials, or the creatures are clunky enough in order to get value out of it. Then we have our Island Walk Lords, core to the deck. Lord of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident. I think these are the sacred cows to the deck that I almost never will remove, because this is what makes Merfolk Merfolk. You just play this Lord on the battlefield, and then all of a sudden, all the random dinky stuff that you have on the battlefield, the random Benthic Biomass or the random Silver Gill Adept, they're attacking for a lot of damage. So these Lords do that great in that way, but the most important thing is how it cheats in combat. We get unblockable creatures if our opponent has an island, and if we play Spreading Seas on our opponent's land, then we have unblockable creatures. We are cheating in combat. Combat is the most complicated thing in Magic, make no mistake. That's what makes Limited such a difficult game to play, because it's always this wall of creatures versus another wall of creatures. You break that complication with clearly unblockable creatures. Not flying, unblockable. Merfolk Trickster, one of the best cards in our Merfolk Toolbox, because for 2 mana we have a 2/2 flash creature, and that's good enough just against control decks and combo decks, because it lets us hold up our mana for counter spells, waiting for something more important to do with our mana. And if they don't do anything, that's okay. We don't waste our mana because we can flash in the Merfolk Trickster. But it's also good in combat, being able to tap down our opponent's big creatures and make our creatures lose their abilities. Tapping, even hitting a Plague Engineer, it will make our creatures a lot bigger for a turn, and also taps down the Plague Engineer from being able to potentially block. Not to mention, we all know the Tarmogoyf trick. If you target Tarmogoyf, however big it is, it turns into a 0/1. It makes it much more easier to kill. So Mirror Reedry is also one of the better lords in the Merfolk deck, because of the ability to, not only does it give all the other creatures +1/+1, but whenever we cast a creature, we can tap or untap a permanent. That clears our way for an attack if there's like a big creature in the way, like Gurmag Angler or Death Shadow. Also, it allows us to empty our hand, because we can pay 2 blue to cast a creature, but untap one of our lands to be able to cast more creatures per turn. Mirror Reedry will help us dump our hand if we're lucky to untap with it. Usually they'll kill it. They know the danger of Mirror Reedry. It's like we're Affinity for fish. But if they don't kill it, we are going to be in a really good position to win the game. Thassa, God of the Sea. Now, I will say I only have 2 of here, because I've never seen myself ever having to reach for more Thassas. Thassa's indestructible, and some people have called it a planeswalker on a creature. You know what? I cannot debate that. That is a very good, accurate way of calling Thassa. So Thassa is very good in any games that will go long, and they have to go long, because the greatest part about Thassa is the scrying every single turn. Every single turn you're going to draw a good card. You see a land on top of your deck, that's okay, just put it to the bottom and draw something better. If you need lands, you see a creature on top of your deck, okay, scry to the bottom, try to dig for your lands. So Thassa, if the game goes like another 6 or 8 turns, you're going to grind out your opponent. So it needs that sort of metagame. Also, it's indestructible, pretty good in so it's good in grindy matchups, and because it's indestructible, it's good against attrition-based decks, because you can't remove Thassa from the battlefield, and also it helps us get unblockable creatures. So even if our opponent doesn't have an island for Island Walk, we just randomly give a creature unblockable for a blue and a generic. Brazen Borrower ended up being one of the best cards being printed recently for the Merfolk Toolbox, coming from Throne of Eldraine. It is a way of answering Ensnaring Bridge, and we desperately need ways to answer Ensnaring Bridge. That is basically the one bane of our life in the modern Merfolk in the modern format for Merfolk. If our opponent plays Ensnaring Bridge, we can't attack with anything. We have no win condition. We need to be able to bounce it. And we have tools like Echoing Truth, but Echoing Truth is just card disadvantage. If we only play Echoing Truth for Ensnaring Bridge, I think it's a waste, but I don't even like Echoing Truth in any creature-based decks, because if you bounce the creature and they just replay it, well, you're just down a card. But here with Brazen Borrower, we got the Petty Theft. for bouncing something, but we still have a card in the form of Brazen Borrower. Double blue and a generic, a 3/1 flash creature with flying, and there's other advantages for Brazen Borrower. There's a lot of people that didn't like that it was a Merfolk, and I say, it's great that it's not a Merfolk, because it hedges against Plague Engineer. Plague Engineer, when it's on the battlefield and names Merfolk, is going to shrink all our creatures, but it's not going to shrink Brazen Borrower because this creature is a fairy rogue. There are so many games where my opponent has Plague Engineer on Merfolk, even double Plague Engineer, but then I slam the Brazen Borrower, attack for 3 in the air. Unblockable, basically, because they don't. Jund doesn't have any flyers. Grixis Death Shadow doesn't have any flyers, and we attack for victory. So that is actually an advantage that it's not a Merfolk, that it's a fairy. And a great clock, 3 power creature. What's not to love about it? And flash speed, so you can still hold up your interaction, hold up your counter spells, and if the coast is clear, play the Brazen Borrower. Vendilion Click, particularly great in metagames where our opponent might have some very big clunky threats. Things like Urza is a relatively clunky threat, where if you know that's coming, you slam Vendilion Click, get rid of the Urza in their hand, but also just in general good against combo decks and control decks. I think a slower metagame is where Vendilion Click is at. Has similar advantages to Brazen Borrower in that you also play around Plague Engineer. If they name Merfolk, this is a fairy wizard. You can still attack in the air freely for 3 damage, and also has flying. Not to mention, you can always click yourself. That is an option. Get rid of extra dead cards that you don't need right now in that in the matchup, and dig for the cards that you really do need. Master of Waves, the most expensive card in the Merfolk archetype, but the most powerful. Predominantly better if there is a very red-heavy metagame, full of burn, prowess. I still like it against attrition-based decks because it's an army in one. If they snipe off every damn little creature that you have on the battlefield, you can just back this up with Master of Waves, slam it. And even if you don't even have that much devotion, if you just have like a random Silvergill Adept and Benthic Biomass on the battlefield, then 3 devotion on the battlefield with Master of Waves equals 8 power on the battlefield, because there will be 3 2/1 tokens coming with the Master of Waves. So the Master of Waves is the most powerful card in this deck. The downside is the clunkiness. If the format is really fast, we cannot play Master of Waves because we'll be dead before we can even cast them. Usually it'll just be a dead card in the hand. So the format needs to be slow enough for Master of Waves to be impactful, or red-based enough so that we have a card that when we play on the battlefield, they can't remove it and it's terrifying to them. Venser Shaper Savant. So I'm not ready to get rid of this card yet from my toolbox, but I would say that Venser was, the main purpose of Venser was to bounce Ensnaring Bridge. That role has been taken over by Brazen Borrower. So I still have Venser Shaper Savant in my toolbox, but I have to say that this card is sort of on the way out. Maybe Venser has a little bit of game if Supreme Verdict is going to be really important, a really big player, because you can always return. What Venser does is when it enters the battlefield, return target spell or permanent to its owner's hand. So you can return a spell like Supreme Verdict back to their hand. But I have to say that this is a card that I'm reaching to less and less in my Merfolk toolbox, and maybe by 2021 won't be part of it. But until then, Venser is still there. Commander Speaker is like one of the main reasons you want to go Simic, because you have more power at 1 mana. You have more power at 2 mana. We'll talk about Merfolk Mistbinder in a second. But Commander Speaker can be a 3/3 creature by turn 2 when you back it up with a Lord. So for 1 mana, you have a 2/2 creature if you have a Merfolk or Island in play. So if you cast this off of Breeding Pool, you automatically have a 2/2 creature and can start attacking for 3 damage once you play your Lord on turn 2. A Lord like Merfolk Mistbinder. And the thing is, when you go Simic, you have just so much more power at 1 mana and 2 mana. With Merfolk Mistbinder, you now have 12 Lords at 2 mana. So the odds that you have a much more powerful start and can clock your opponent by turn 4, there are way more turn 4 wins with Simic than with Mono Blue. You're dealing way more damage. The disadvantage is that you're taking more damage. We're going to talk about that later, but your lands deal way more damage to you. The Horizon lands, the Fetch lands, the Shock lands, you're going to take more damage. So you want to play this in a metagame where you need to be fast, but also not exactly in a metagame where it's really burn heavy. Burn will destroy this deck, or in any metagame where you need to keep your life total really high, Simic may not be what you want, but Simic is there if you need the extra power to close out the games before the opponent might close the game out on you. And lastly, Another good reason to go Simic is Collector Oof. If there are any broken, busted artifact decks out there, Collector Oof says activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. We're talking to you, Walking Ballista. Yeah, are you listening? We're talking to you, Tron. Your expedition maps, your chromatic spheres, your chromatic stars, all that Oblivion Stone, all that stuff turns to trash. They're all just dead weight because Collector Oof says activated abilities of artifacts can't be played. Same thing can be said about Hardened Scales Affinity. You can't activate that stuff anymore. So anyway, Collector Oof is a fantastic card to help hose artifacts and is another reason to go green. So going from the creatures, let us turn to the spells. So now let's look at the spells. Let's start off with Ceremonious Rejection. And by the way, when I talk about spells, I'm talking instant sorceries or enchantments. That's basically how I'm going to define spells here. Enchantments maybe should have its own category, but I'm just going to lump it in here with the spells. So Ceremonious Rejection is a really good, efficient way at 1 mana to counter colorless spells. And even against Eldrazi-tron. And I know Eldrazi-tron has Cavernous Souls, but that's okay because you can still counter Walking Ballista. You can still counter Karn the Great Creator. You can still counter Ugin the Inevitable. So there is a lot of... You can still counter Expedition Map. All is dust. There are... Ensnaring Bridge, you have the options. You have a lot of things in that deck that you can counter, even though their Eldrazi will be uncounterable from time to time. But if they don't have Cavernous Souls, hey, that is a really good rate. 1 mana, counter that Thought-Knot Seer, that's beautiful. Those are the tempo swings that are going to help you win those matches. We've got Dispel. Now, I'll have to admit that Dispel is really fighting for space against our other counter spells like Deprive, Force Negation, and also Chalice of the Void, but there's no better way, there's no more efficient way to counter instant speed cards than with Dispel. So I mean, this card is going to be really good against Ad Nauseam that tries to win at instant speed. This card is very good against Burn, because for 1 mana you counter any instant. Seize Claim. Now Seize Claim has gotten weaker and weaker with the prominence of the snow-colored these Snowlands, Arkham's Astrolabe decks, because Seize Claim combined with Spreading Seas means that... Seize Claim combined with Spreading Seas mean that you can turn into like basically a mono blue Ponza deck. Enchanted Land becomes an island. So at 1 mana and at 2 mana, you have a lot of cards that turns those Jund decks into a blue color deck. Cutting them off 1 to 2 colors is great. You have the density of these enchantments to turn people into basically a mono blue deck. Boggles hates this. Burn hates this. Ponza's gonna hate this. Jund hates this. Like, if they can't use blue mana, they absolutely hate this strategy. But the problem is, it's also usually good against control decks. No, it's pseudo good against control decks, but there's a lot of decks that are now going blue. And this strategy just like doesn't work at all. And it's just too high risk, because Spreading Seas isn't even good against... I'll say Spreading Seas isn't good against blue decks generally, unless it's backed up with Tectonic Edge. So anyway, and there's a lot of snow-colored decks right now that undermine the strategy, so it's not really that good to get into, but it's available there, especially if the snow decks disappear. Spell Pierce, another counter spell that's really fighting for space, but is generally the most efficient 1 mana card that can counter not only instants and sorceries, but also planeswalkers. So Hurkyl's Recall is going to be a card that you're going to want to play because it's damn strong against artifact strategies. So with 1 card, you can just bounce all your opponent's artifacts back to their hand, and it is glorious. That is where you want to be with Hurkyl's Recall. Then we go to Spreading Seas, one of the core cards of the Merfolk deck. Spreading Seas enchants a land, you can take people off Tron mana, you get your Island Walk, that is the synergy that you're trying to get with Spreading Seas and your Island Walk Lords. So Spreading Seas enters the battlefield, your opponent loses generally a land or a creature land. You can hit the creatures. Sorry, you can hit their creature lands like Inkmoth Nexus and Blighted Agent and so on. They lose their creatures, you get Island Walk, you get that those unblockable creatures, and you send in for the win. I think Spreading Seas, again, is getting weaker because of the Arkham's Astrolabe decks, and there's no Blood Moon decks out there. So Spreading Seas, I think, is mainly for mainly to take people off Tron mana. I think that's against Eldrazi, Tron, and Tron. That is basically the most impactful strategy of Spreading Seas today. Deprive is like the best counterspell right now for Modern Merfolk. Counters anything, and for 2 blue mana. And returning a land back to your hand, not a very big cost for a deck that's playing with Ether Vial. So Deprive, you don't even need to counter anything on turn 2. You can wait till turn 3 or 4 in order to do something. So Deprive, definitely the best counter spell for Merfolk, the modern Merfolk archetype. And it's like, the fact that it can counter creatures is a huge game changer. Counter Uro, counter Snapcaster Mage, counter Primeval Titan. That is the power of Deprive in the modern Merfolk archetype of 2020. Force Negation was also a huge game changer because now we have more options than ever to just tap out, play our creatures on the battlefield, and if they play anything, Anger of the Gods or Damnation or some sweeper or some win condition through combo, we can be tapped out and we have an answer to it. Force Negation. And not only that, we don't even just counter it, we exile it. So you can't fill up your graveyard. You can't flash it back with Snapcaster Mage later. Force Negation, one of the best cards for the modern Merfolk deck. Now, Cryptic Command is sort of a fringe playable now. Again, this used to be an answer to Bounce and Snaring Bridge, but I like Cryptic Command because it can be also extra copies of Spreading Seas if I really need it to be, while also being a counter spell. Now, let me explain how it's an extra Spreading Seas. We can tap all the creatures our opponents control, so it will basically pseudo give us unblockable creatures. When we need to attack, tap all your creatures, draw a card, send in for the win, while also still being a way to bounce permanents, counter spells, and also drawing cards. I like Cryptic Command. Now, Repeal was popularized by another Merfolk master, M. Hayashi, and showed us that the card is playable in its own right in any metagame, but if there's a metagame where there's a lot of 0 mana cards that you can bounce, tokens like the Germ token from Stoneforge Mystic, this is a really strong card because basically for 1 blue you bounce those tokens and you draw a card. So in any metagame where you can bounce 0 mana permanents is a huge tempo swing and also card advantage. Not to mention, hey, it is really good value. In response to your opponent's removal, bounce your own Silvergill Adept back to your hand, draw a card, your opponent lost a card, then replay your Silvergill Adept, draw another card. Really good value. Dismember is like the premier removal spell for the Merfolk archetype. Kills like basically all the common creatures. Like it generally will always kill Tarmogoyf, Scavenging Ooze, kills Gurmag Angler. It will kill Death Shadow unless the opponent's Death Shadow is really big, which in that case they're really close to dying to our creatures. So it's like a bit of a game whether they want to be out of range of Dismember, or do they could be out of range of Dismember but then they're close to dead, or they can make their creature weak to Dismember but they have a safe life total. Dismember basically just kills like anything in the format. The only thing it doesn't kill is basically like Uro or Primeval Titan, but that is not a big deal breaker. Gutshot, I haven't been reaching for this card, but it's definitely a playable card in the Merfolk archetype. For zero mana, or basically 2 life, you can kill any 1 mana target. So when the metagame is full of 1 toughness creatures, this is a huge tempo swing that we can take advantage of. Generally good against mana dorks, can also be good against any just 1 toughness creature, period. Shaper's Sanctuary is a way of getting way ahead of any player that's trying to grind out the Simic Merfolk deck. If you're trying to win with removal, it's not going to work. Shaper's Sanctuary is going to draw cards. Hey, you want to play your Walking Ballista, and every single time you target the Merfolk for 1 damage, we draw a card? Hey, I'm all game for that. That's great value. And then lastly, we got Ashok Dreamrender, a great sideboard card against any graveyard strategy like Dredge. You can exile all the cards from their graveyard, and also it's good against any deck that has to search their library. But usually the Primeval Titan decks, like when they try to search with something like Summoner's Pact, Ashok is a fantastic card to reach for in those metagames. So from there, let's look at the artifacts that we've got. I just thought that there was more artifacts in my Merfolk Toolbox, but I guess not. The best one, of course, Ether Vial. Ether Vial is like the card that makes the Merfolk deck so mana efficient, but also allows us to play all our creatures at flash speed at end of turn. Makes it very difficult for our opponents to make blocks or any sort of strategy if we've got Ether Vial untapped on 2. If we have it untapped on 2, are we going to play Silvergill Adept? Are we going to play a Lord? Are we going to play Merfolk Trickster? Are we going to play Harbinger the Tides? And you know what? We could play any of these things. Our range of options in the toolbox are so wide. Ether Vial is one of the best cards in the Merfolk archetype. Then we got Grafdigger's Cage. You're going to reach for this when there's like it's really graveyard centric. Like if there's a lot of dredge decks out there, you're gonna want to pull out your Grafdigger's Cages. Relic is also a soft answer in a dredge metagame, but it's mostly there to deal with Snapcaster Mage, because this is a much better response against Snapcaster Mage, given the fact that if your opponent plays Snapcaster Mage and they try to target a card, you crack Relic and you exile the graveyards and you draw a card. So there is a bit of an advantage there. And then there is... So it's good against Snapcaster Mage and good again in any metagame where you need to keep the graveyards empty, which also could be against Scavenging Ooze, Lurrus, it's good against Tarmogoyf. So like any Tarmogoyf deck, you keep the graveyard empty and then your opponent cannot do anything with your Tarmogoyf becomes a 0/1. Good. It's good stuff to me. Damping Sphere. This card is good in a lot of matchups. I mean, it's good against Tron, because it turns all the lands into just 1-mana lands. It's good against Amulet Titan, because again, they're more expensive lands get cheaper. They can't play multiple spells a turn like Summoner's Pact and Primeval Titan so easily. It's also good against combo decks, because comboing off requires more mana, so it slows them down by a lot. So Damping Sphere, good in a wide variety of matchups. You're going to want to have Damping Sphere in your sideboard. Damping Matrix. This is a card I think everyone should just own just because it's 50 cents. And this card hoses Devoted Devastation. This card hoses Hardened Scales Affinity because they can't activate any abilities. Alright, you can tap to add mana with your Devoted Druid, but you can't untap it because activated abilities of artifacts and creatures can't be activated unless they are mana abilities. So this card is just a 1-card win condition against a lot of those decks, and they don't even have answers to this thing. If you play Damping Matrix, those decks are going to die. Also is pretty effective against Urza decks because Emery and Engineered Explosives and Mishra's Bauble can't be activated. Same thing with Urza. You can't activate Urza. Damping Matrix is fantastic there. I think everyone... It's a pretty narrow card, but it's really cheap right now. It's only 50 cents. I think this is a card everyone should buy. Chalice of the Void, one of the best cards against any metagame where everyone's trying to be playing really greedy, everyone's playing really fast with 1-mana cards. Chalice of the Void on 1 or 0 pending the metagame is just a win condition in itself. Chalice of the Void is one of the most powerful options that you want to have in your toolbox, but be warned, it might be sitting in your toolbox gathering dust most of the time. I'm not always reaching for Chalice of the Void. When Chalice of the Void, here's the thing with Chalice of the Void. When it's cheap, no one wants it because it's not playable in the metagame, but then when you need it, the price rises to the top and it's too late to buy. So I think this is a card you want to buy when no one wants it, and then you just let it sit in your toolbox, sitting waiting for the time for Chalice of the Void to get brought back into playability. But the thing is, you have to wait for that moment, because if you wait for Chalice of the Void to become useful in all the decks, then the price is going to rise really high, and then you can't afford it because everyone needs Chalice of the Void. But it's one of the most powerful options for free wins in the Merfolk deck. And lastly, let's finish off with, well, not exactly finish off, but we'll continue with the lands. We got 12 snow-covered islands. I just want to start with these snow-covered islands. In today's metagame, you have to play with snow-covered lands. You just have to. Because there are a lot of snow-covered decks. Urza and the snow control decks, they're all playing snow lands. So if you were to play just a basic island that's not a snow-covered island, your opponent can deduce, okay, my opponent's playing Urza, or Uroza, or any Uro control deck, or any snow-covered deck at all, so they have to be playing Merfolk. It's as simple as that. So if you go Snow-Covered Island Go, you could be playing anything still. The range of options are really wide open. But if you go Basic Island Pass, now your opponent knows that you cannot be any of those prominent decks in the metagame, and you have to be something like Merfolk. So I just want to throw that out there, and I don't think you could ever need more than 12, because if you have any more than 12, then that means you're not taking advantage of the other utility lands that we have here, like Fairy Conclave, Cavern of Souls, Castle Vantress, or Fiery Islet, any of the Horizon lands. Really, Mutavault. So I think the most you're going to want is 12. You shouldn't need any more than that. So Botanical Sanctum, basically a Simic land for the Simic deck. You don't take any damage. Basically the best Simic land for that archetype. Then there's Breeding Pool, and I think you want to have. You might be able to go to 4. Can I add another one? Sure, let's go to 4. 3 might be enough. Breeding Pool, you might also want more Breeding Pools than you want fetch lands in a metagame where you don't want to take damage. because you have the choice. Fetch lands like Polluted Delta, you're always taking damage. You want to fetch, you have to take damage. That's not good against burn. That's not good against aggro decks. You want the option. Like, Breeding Pool gives you the option. You can put it into play tap, take no damage, and that's really good for you. So, you want more fetch lands in a metagame with Blood Moon in it. Because if there's more Blood Moon, you need to give yourself more options to fetch your basics out of your deck. When you're a Simic deck, don't play fetches in mono blue. You have enough blue sources in mono blue. But in Simic, you want more fetch lands, and I could even go up to like 3 or 4 here, really. If I need to grab my island, so I could have a certain density of islands and a certain amount of fetch lands, go turn 1 fetch into island, so I don't get wrecked by Blood Moon. Because in Simic, we're playing with a lot of non-basic lands like Botanical Sanctum, Breeding Pool, and fetch lands. So Gas Elvantress, this is a great card that in the long game you can keep scrying and putting gas on top of your deck, and then you can Vial it in and keep scrying every turn. I'll just say that if you're playing with 4 Castle Vantress, or if you're playing with any number of Castle Vantress, make sure you have at least 12 islands. I think that is the minimum number of islands, or like minimum and maximum number of islands you should have in your deck, so that this card does not come into play tapped and is not clunky. Cavern of Souls, basically like one of the best cards to have in a metagame where there's a lot of counter spells. If control is popular, if counter spells are popular, Cavern of Souls will have free wins, because in the games where your opponent is stuck on Spell Snare, Mystical Dispute, Mana Leak, Cryptic Command, Logic Knot, stuff like that, they're all dead cards. You just play your creatures, they can't interact, and you kill them. Cavern of Souls, also a mana fixer for the Simic Merfolk deck. Fairy Conclave, good if you want to make your deck more grindy against attrition-based strategies. Fill your deck up with more of these lands so that you have more creatures, more threat density. As your opponent just snipes them down, you just have more resources than they do. Then we got the Horizon lands, both Fiery Islet and Waterlog Grove. So Waterlog Grove is where you basically want to be in general. Again, for Simic, this is a great dual land. You could reach for Fiery Islet to put your opponent off in mono blue, and also it plays around Pithing Needle if you have some Waterlog Grove, some Fiery Islets. Because if they go Pithing Needle on Waterlog Grove, then that means it's not Pithing Needle on Fiery Islet. Whereas, so if you play with 2 Fiery Islets, 2 Waterlog Groves, and mono blue, which I don't even recommend really, because it's a pretty painful mana base, you would hedge against it. So I don't even really play Fiery Islet, but if you're not playing Simic and you want to throw your opponent off a little bit with Fiery Islet, you're most welcome to. But in general, I'm playing Waterlog Grove. Mutavault, creature for 1 colorless mana. It's where you want to be. I'm mostly playing with 3 these days. I would only reach for 4 in a metagame that is really grindy. I'm mostly on 3 right now. Then we got Oboro, Palace in the Clouds. Actually still a very playable card right now for a blue. You can return it back to your hand, and that helps cycle with Benthic Biomancer as a creature, but also you give yourself a random card to discard against Kolaghan's Command, Kroxa. Well, I guess Kroxa is not an example. Liliana the Veil. Even against Kroxa, if they force you to discard a card and you have a really good important card in your hand, yeah, you want to bounce the Oboro to your hand and discard it, take the 3 damage, and at least keep your gas card in hand. And also helps filter your mana with Mutavault. If you haven't played your land drop for the turn and you have Oboro and Mutavault in play, tap Oboro for a blue, pay a generic from Mutavault to bounce Oboro back to your hand, replay Oboro, tap it for your second blue, and cast your Lords or other double blue spells. So we already talked about the fetch lands. Tectonic Edge, not really reaching for this card really anymore, especially with the snow-covered metagame, but can be used to pretty good effect against Scape-Shift decks that need a certain density of lands in play, and also is good against Tron. Yeah, you need to wait for them to have 4 lands in play, but you know what, in a combination of counter spells and Spreading Seas, that's not a problem. You're still going to be happy to see Tectonic Edge. Now, that is basically my toolbox that I play in 2020, but let's talk a little bit about the toolbox maybe. Now, these are cards I have played in the past, but they don't really see play anymore because they're not really well positioned. So these are all cards that I have had in my toolbox, but I wouldn't really have them in my toolbox anymore because they're just not necessary, or they still need to prove themselves. So like Swan Song, you know what? You counter instant sorceries, enchantments, but you don't counter creatures. You don't counter planeswalkers. And not only that, like you still cost mana. Force negation costs nothing for basically the same thing. So you cost 1 mana and give us our opponent a bird token, but Force Negation just does things a lot better. Vapor Snag just hasn't been reached for. Like, basically it's been replaced by a Brazen Borrower, which can bounce things. Yeah, it's 1 mana, but it's just not as good. It's not as impactful as Brazen Borrower is, which can bounce anything on the battlefield, including creatures, and also is a creature in itself. Brainborn Cutthroat, like, I've played with it a little bit, but it's still not core to my toolbox. It has flash, but we need more flash creatures in order to enable Brainborn Cutthroat. In Echoing Truth, I've hated this card forever. I've never liked this card. I've disagreed with everyone who's ever thought that Echoing Truth is good. This card is worthless. I definitely don't have this in my deck anymore now, now that Brazen Borrower has completely replaced it. Completely replaced this card. Not even close. Boomerang also is in a similar situation. I have reached for Boomerang, which is good against like Amulet Titan and also Amulet Titan and also Tron. Like, balancing the land actually is impactful in those matchups. Sometimes Scapeshift. But you know what? Basically it's the same. It's bouncing in Snaring Bridge, but that duty is taken over by Brazen Borrower. Mystical Dispute is a card that I've never played with in this deck, but in theory you could play it. But I just haven't seen the metagame yet necessary. My counter suite of Deprive, Force Negation, Chalice of the Void is too solid for me to reach for this. Now, Nibble Obstructionist is a card that you could play, and I definitely have, like, I have in my toolbox, but I've just never played it. We haven't reached the metagame where Nibble Obstructionist is good, but it's a very impactful card, and again, a 3/1 creature with flying and flash that plays around Plague Engineer, that is good, and the cycling ability to, like, use against Engineered Explosives. If they use Engineered Explosives against me, no problem. No problem. Cycle this thing, counter that triggered ability. They play Primeval Titan, I'll counter the triggered ability when it enters the battlefield, and that's usually enough tempo for me to swing deck for the win. So, has a lot of potential, but has not seen play yet. You know what, this is not a bad card to pick up. It's pretty cheap, but still is not officially part of my toolbox. Water Trap Weaver was good when metagames had really clunky creatures, but we definitely don't see those metagames anymore, so I'm not running Water Trap Weaver. Kira Great Glass Spinner was very, very good a long time ago when it was really removal heavy, but nowadays I think Kira is more clunky than useful, and the fact that Walking Ballista exists and pretty efficiently can just target something and then blow the counter trigger off, and then you can just use a removal spell. It just makes Kira too inefficient these days. Not to mention, like, same thing with Lava Dart with the Mono Red Prowess deck. Copala, I think, can be good in a metagame dominated by Walking Ballista, but overall still not impactful enough because the tax is just not expensive enough. You know, playing Lightning Bolt and Fatal Push, and it's just not a high enough tax. Wizard's Retort is just basically a bad Deprive. Between Wizard's Retort and Deprive, after playing for years, the Merfolk community has determined that Deprive is just better. The fact if you don't have a wizard on the battlefield, this is just a cancel, and it's not good enough. So it really is important that the card always costs 2 mana. But do you know what? If there's a metagame where you really need a 5th or 6th version of Deprive, this card would be it, but we're not in that metagame. I have reached for Collected Company in the past for Simic Merfolk, and it worked with a really good effect. But I have not been able to reach for this card in a very long time, and I think Shaper Sanctuary does a better job than Collected Company. Collected Company is a good way of, like, refilling the board if my opponent has killed off all my creatures, and you have this splash speed interaction. But with Shaper Sanctuary, I think it's just more useful than Collected Company these days, especially against Walking Ballista. Gemstone Caverns was a way of, like, grinding back, or, like, sorry, getting ahead in tempo from the early portion of the game, but I don't think it is as necessary as it used to be. I think it's better in a metagame where you don't have many 1-drops and you're so 2-drop heavy that you want to start the game up with your 2-drops, but card disadvantage is serious. But yeah, so then there's Minamo. This card will be good the day we have a good legendary creature. No mistake, you know what? If you're playing with Vendilion Clique, you might want to reach for this card, but for the most part, we don't have legendary creatures to use it. Look, we're not using Copala. It's a Nombo with Kira Great Glass Spinner because if you target Kira, then it'll just get countered. So Minamo used to also be Choke Insurance, but we have so many lands these days, so many lands that are Choke Insurance. We got Botanical Sanctum, Castle Vantress, Cavern of Souls, Fairy Conclave, Mutavault, Oboro. We don't need Waterlog Grove. We don't need any more Choke Insurance. Wonderwine Hub has basically, Minamo as choke insurance has basically disappeared. Same thing with Wanderwine Hub. We don't need choke insurance. That's basically what Wanderwine Hub was for. If you're playing Blue-White Merfolk and Blue-White Merfolk can become a thing, Wanderwine Hub will come back, but until then, it's in the maybe board. Soul Guide Lantern, I've reached for this card before, but in general, I still would prefer Relic of Progenitus, and I would need the right metagame for Soul Guide Lantern. It would have to be like a really the right metagame for Soul Guide Lantern to become useful. It was useful for a little while when Lurrus was around, and Lurrus was broken, but right now the companions are fair, so I don't really see myself reaching for Soul Guide Lantern anytime soon. Phyrexian Revoker. Hey, it was fine against activated abilities. I mean, you can name Walking Ballista with this thing, and it's a creature attached to it. You can name Planeswalkers. I like that, but I don't really see myself reaching for Phyrexian Revoker anytime soon. Maybe it should still be in the toolbox somewhere, but it's more in the maybe toolbox. I think it's real. Everything is here because it's really rare if I really touch it, and I don't think it's a priority for anyone to make this part of their toolbox. Smuggler's Copter. I don't really see myself going to this card anymore. It's clunky, it's hard to block with this thing. It's not card advantage, it's just card looting, and it's not something I'm looking to play. The thing is, with Smuggler's Copter, the card is fine, but it comes at the cost of blocking, because you're constantly tapping your creatures to activate this thing. There aren't enough creature decks these days. I want to have creatures untapped to be able to interact with my opponents. And there was Sorcerer's Spyglass. You know, in theory you could play this, but I've not really found the metagame for it. So these are all cards, like, I played them at one point or another for the most part, but I can't really say that I can't really recommend anyone spending any money on these things right now in 2020. So I hope that was really informative. I hope for anyone who's looking to get into the modern Merfolk archetype, that this is a great resource for you to reach for. If you want to know any of these cards, I've got that all in the description below. You can follow the link for a full list of that thing. You don't need to take screenshots, don't worry. Go check out the description below for the link to my toolbox. And if you found this video valuable, if you liked it, don't forget to give a like. And if you want to talk more Merfolk, go check out my streams. You can find my schedule in the description below. So this has been Nikachu, Merfolk Master, giving you the toolbox for Merfolk in 2020.